through, he has certainly been there for me to support, and I really appreciate Professor Reese's work, and I welcome him here to New South Wales Parliament, the oldest parliament in the country. And I also acknowledge and welcome Andrew West, ABC, a good friend of mine as well. We've recently met at a local shop where we had a good discussion over various sandwiches and various things, religious and otherwise, politics. Andrew is a ABC reporter, religion, humanity, honesty, the whole lot, and that's Andrew West. I want to thank Ahmed Pollitt, Affinity Intercultural Foundation. I've known Ahmed for a long, long time. It is an honour for me to host you here at New South Wales Parliament. And I thank also Karen for her work in this project. I won't be taking too much of the time so that we can hand over to Professor Stuart Rees in conversation with Andrew West. But to say that Professor Rees is a real stalwart of humanity and justice. For over 20 years, Stewart has been a professor of social work and social policy at the University of Sydney. I think more than 20 years. He was also elected fellow at the Senate of the University of Sydney for a number of years before his retirement. He's awarded awards include Simon Fellowship at the University of Manchester, a Humanities Fellowship at the City University of Hong Kong, an honorary doctorate and award of highest honour for contribution to world peace, conferred by Soka University. In 2005, he was awarded a membership of the Order of Australia for services to international relations, particularly as Director of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. He is retired, but you would never tell because he's so active, so involved, and he's there fighting for everything and anything that he can see injustices being perpetrated against people. I want to just say a couple of things about the book. I read out a couple of things about the book, Cruelty and Humanity, and encourage everybody to buy this book. Couple of things that I will read out here from this book. Noam Chomsky, University of Arizona, and he says on Professor Rees, "It's no exaggeration to say that the survival of humanity will be determined by decisions that must be made without delay. The wise and perceptive words in this inquiry into our conditions and our fate are a wonderful guide to confronting and overcoming the severe challenges that are imminent." These are the words of Noam Chomsky. And Melissa Park, a former federal member, a great fighter for the rights of the Palestinian people. She's dedicated to the cause, and she has all our respects for what she does. And here she is saying this in relation to Professor Rees's book. And she says, "A unique work of stunning breadth and insight, outlining the innumerable cruelties practiced by state and non-state actors while illuminating a more hopeful path for our common humanity through courage and eternal wisdom of poetry." Those are wonderful words, but they really depict what this book is about, and really, more importantly, depict what Professor Rees is all about. And I'll leave you now with a conversation with Andrew and Professor Rees. I hope you do enjoy it. It'll certainly be illuminating, and I'm certainly staying in the theaterette to listen to the entire conversation. Thank you so much. I hope you do enjoy it. Thank you.
So, without further ado, I would now like to introduce today's distinguished facilitator, Andrew West, who will question Stuart about his propositions. Andrew is an old friend and colleague from the ABC, a journalist and broadcaster who currently presents the Religion and Ethics Report on ABC Radio National. He was a senior reporter at the Sydney Morning Herald, the Sun Herald and the Australian, and is the author of 2 books on Australian politics and culture, including a biography of the former Foreign Minister and New South Wales Premier, Bob Carr. Andrew's work has appeared in the Best Australian Political Writing, the New York Times, the South China Morning Post, the Monthly and the Christian Science Monitor. He's also been a regular fill-in host for 2 of ABC-RN's flagship radio programs, Late Night Live and Saturday Extra, and a correspondent for BBC Religion. He's a graduate of the University of Sydney and Columbia University in New York, and in 2013 the alumni of Sydney University elected him a Fellow of the Senate, the university's governing body. Welcome, Andrew West.
Thank you, John, and thank you for coming. I have to take some responsibility for dragging people here, because I did say, let's not do just another webinar. Can we do something revolutionary in 2021, and that is meet face to face? So even though it's an intimate crowd, it's great to be here. I just want to say again to Shaket, thank you very much to Shaket Mosulmain, member of the upper house here, and a long-time supporter of many human rights causes, and also thanks to Affinity for hosting this event. I'm glad that we could come together. I know that you're seeing us on YouTube and online, but be assured there are some of us who have met, and that's great. Stewart is a very old friend of mine, going back 30 years. He wasn't a teacher of mine at Sydney University, but I somehow knew him at Sydney University as an academic presence, and as someone who thought very deeply about the kind of issues that are encapsulated in this book. Stewart is one of the founders of the Sydney Peace Prize, which has really developed an international reputation for recognising those who advocate for human rights and a very holistic idea of peace, that is, peace with justice. Stewart's book, Cruelty or Humanity, is a dissertation, I guess, on governance. He's got some poetry, which I'm going to ask him to quote at some point. But, Stewart, I just want to start with the sort of definition that you use of cruelty, or one of the definitions that you use of cruelty. You refer to wanton cruelty. What is very specific about the idea of wanton cruelty?
Well, it's about the imposition of pain on people, which is arbitrary without any reference to what is right or wrong. It's almost sort of an amoral action, as long as the perpetrator imposes pain or harm. And you know, the word wanton is actually used in all sorts of international law definitions, but essentially it's about that arbitrariness without, it's almost as though people can act without any reference to conscience.
I wonder whether the limitation, though, on the idea of wanton cruelty is that it lets cruelty by accident off the hook in a way, if you know what I'm talking about. Unintended cruelty, or cruelty that may not be unintended but may be foreseen. Well, that is just something we have to accept as a consequence. I'm wondering if it's an arbitrary distinction, Stewart.
No, I don't think so. I think for people to argue that, you know, I'm sorry it was accidental, looks to me in most countries like a cultural cop-out. That the overwhelming evidence in democracies, dictatorships and theocracies is that all sorts of deliberation goes on. It may be partly unconscious, you might say, almost a taken for granted attitude towards people considered unworthy, but there are deliberations there which suggest that the notion wanton is appropriate.
Where does the idea of wanton cruelty appear in various human rights instruments and various declarations?
Well, it's there in the Convention against Cruelty and Inhumane Punishment. It's there in the Convention about the Rights of the Child. It's certainly there in the European Human Rights Convention, for example.
And how many of these instruments or conventions is Australia a party to?
Well, we were a party to almost all of them. I mean, the one, in a way, it's a form of wanton cruelty, is the refusal to sign the treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. I mean, that may seem like a bit of an indirect answer, but it's a pretty serious one.
Yeah. But I suppose, I guess the point that I'm making is that Australia should have a proud record here, because I think in the post-World War II era, Herbert Vere Evatt, Doc Evatt, was a was an advocate, very early advocate for the International Convention on Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Have we always lived up to that?
No, there's a big difference between what people say and what they do. And unfortunately, Australia has chosen to take human rights seriously when it's convenient, when it appears to embarrass them, as in the treatment of asylum seekers. Then we no longer take human rights very seriously. In other words, in your words, we don't live up to the high standards of Doc Everett.
I'm also thinking, you don't mention him specifically in this book, but the four freedoms principle of Franklin Roosevelt. Well, you could elaborate on those, because in a way they hang like a shadow over the idea of cruelty or humanity.
Sure. Well, I mean, in a way, I'd condense them to two essential freedoms, which are within the Universal Declaration, which is the freedom from different forms of oppression, hunger, poverty, homelessness, and so on, and the freedom too, which is about the entitlement of every citizen of the world to achieve their potential if they can. And every fight for justice is essentially about freedom. I mean, the people who protested across cities of Australia at the weekend over a modicum of justice for asylum seekers and refugees, we're talking about those freedoms.
I suppose the reason I invoked the four freedoms, I think it was freedom of speech, and there was freedom of expression, freedom of religion,
association,
freedom of association. There was freedom from want and freedom from fear, as a concept.
Sure,
they would seem to embody what the post-war outlook was about, wasn't it? I mean, just give us an idea, because you do deal with it in this book, of that season of hope that came after the Shoah, which itself had been preceded by the Armenian genocide, preceded by a whole lot of other human rights abuses.
Well, I'll make 3 points. The first is the general one about the idea that the Universal Declaration was meant to represent the highest aspirations of the common man or common woman, common humanity, the highest possible aspirations. It was a wonderful challenge. Since then, the freedoms really, or the issue of human rights, boils down to two distinct sets of rights, which is a bit of a problem. On the one hand, you've got the political and civil rights, which you mentioned, which the West is very strong on. You can hear every day now the protest about the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur people, and that's meritorious. Then there's the social and economic rights, which is about dealing with asylum seekers fairly, dealing with poverty and homelessness. And we often make a great noise about political and civil rights, overlooking the challenge of social and economic rights. Because when I go to dangerous countries and where people are monumentally poor, the issue is about social and economic rights, not always about freedom of speech and association.
There was an attempt after World War II, though, in certain countries, I think in Australia included, but certainly in the UK with the Attlee government, to build in some of those social and economic rights. Across Western Europe, for example, governments, whether they were centre-right or centre-left, social democratic or Christian democratic, they all also tried to build up this idea of social and economic rights. What happened there? Where did it all get lost?
Well, you make a great point, because if I wanted to build a civil society, then the foundation brick is almost certainly universal health insurance. In other words, nobody's entitled to make money out of other people's sickness, something that is ignored almost completely in the United States. Look, I think why did this disappear? Why were those principles eroded. I think the rise of the so-called free market, the arrival of Ronald Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher, and advised by Milton Friedman from the Chicago School, saying, you know, everybody and everything is a commodity to be bargained over in the commercial marketplace. And so for a long time that was a sort of greed is a good idea, greed is good, accumulate as much as you can, life is meant to be a competition, and that's where it was eroded.
You talk about people being commodified. In this book, though, you talk about people being commodified in the worst possible ways. We're not just talking here about the mistreatment of a worker, as bad, as heinous as that is. Tell me about the way that certain types of people, certain classes of humanity have to be dehumanised in order for there to be systematic cruelty.
Sure. Well, it's the way perpetrators decide very deliberately in many cases who the victims are. The victims are usually people defined as unworthy or less than human. We could start off with the indigenous peoples of the world in the Americas, across Australia. They were people, they were expendable. We could return to historical interpretations of certain people as not even existing. I understand it was a criminal offence in Myanmar to mention the word Rohingya. They didn't exist. And for years, the Palestinians
Bengalis, I think they still refer to them.
Exactly the same attitude that I've observed when I've been in India to the Dalits, in the propping up of the caste system. But look, the not very far away treatment of unmarried mothers. I mean, the most dramatic examples are the Magdalena laundry in Ireland, but we had our repeats here. The British had their repeats. Julia Gillard apologised about the treatment of unmarried mothers. A couple of months later, Gordon Brown, as Prime Minister of the UK, made a similar apology. So in order for powerful people to establish identity, it seems that they have to demean and label and stigmatise the other.
And it becomes extraordinarily systematic too. Slaves in the United States were 3/5 of... I mean, it was terribly scientific. This was how it was sort of worked out. It was given this patina of science. How for example, has official policy been used to aid genocide? I mean, science was a version of science merged with a version of religion to give it almost a moral imperative for operations like the KKK. And not so very recently, you had the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, justifying the treatment of children at the Mexican border, the cruel treatment of thousands of kids, by reference to the Bible and a reference to science. All sorts of weird justifications are used. Not weird, but wanton justifications are used to persist with cruel policies. But my problem is that even the word cruelty hardly ever appears in the analysis of policies. I could look at 20 years of public policy, economic policy textbooks, and the word cruelty is not in the index. I want to deal with, because it's so recurrent in the book, this question of the treatment of asylum seekers, refugees. Because it isn't straightforward, though, is it, Stewart? There was a very good essay, for example, in the New York Review of Books, talking about the Trump administration's treatment of children on the US border. And they made the argument that cruelty was the point there. But now Joe Biden faces the same problem. And even if we accept that Joe Biden's motivation is much more benign, he seems to be a much more decent character. But the outcome is still the same, isn't it?
Sure.
Children are still being separated from their parents on the US border. This is a very vexed issue, because there's going to be an attempt at a systematic political solution that even if it's born out of the most benign motive, is going to have a cruel outcome.
Sure. Look, I'm always a bit cautious when I'm told that something is really complex. On the one hand, I admit that, but on the other hand, there's a simplicity about justice. And if you talk the dialogue of justice, the wonderful poet Brecht said that justice was the bread of the people, and just as daily bread is necessary, so is daily justice. It's even necessary several times a day. Now, it's all right for me on a stage to say that, but in the short term and in the long term, that has to be the language. Those have to be the values about the policies. Whether they speak to them about when the American representatives go to Honduras or Nicaragua or Guatemala or Mexico. That has to be, that's the end point. Unless you have a vision, like, what the hell is justice about, then the day-to-day problems of dealing fairly and expeditiously with those vulnerable kids won't occur.
I'm thinking, though, if I go back 20 years, I was a journalist at the Sun Herald, a Sunday newspaper, not the sort of newspaper that I would have expected that would have, championed these issues, but I was writing a lot about asylum seekers, especially after 9/11, and then you had a pretty big migration of Hazara people coming out of Afghanistan. And I wrote a lot about this over the course of about 18 months or 2 years. But I have to tell you, I never had an answer to the question that was put to me, but Andrew, what do we do about people getting on boats and drowning? What is your answer? And my answer was the coward's way out. Well, I'm just the reporter, I don't have the answers. I never had an answer to that, though. I knew that what we were doing to asylum seekers once they got to Australia was quite cruel, putting them in Woomera and these extremely hot, in the middle of deserts. But I never had an answer to the question: how do you stop people, or how do you dissuade people putting their own lives at risk on boats? That's what I mean by the complexity of it. Yeah,
well, that's fair enough. But there was we made the Tampa episode complex when it need not have been.
Yeah,
a principled Norwegian skipper picked up those 200-odd people. We said, no, you're not in. This is Fortress Australia. You're not allowed to come here. So, and then all the complexities have followed ever since. If the basic principle of international law had been followed, then and if Kim Beazley had jumped up in the Parliament and said, "No, I disagree with you, Mr. Prime Minister," I think we would have had a much certainly a more socially just outcome, and the years of misery of people paid a fortune to stay on those remote islands would not have occurred.
The people weren't paid a fortune, but the Australian taxpayer
paid
billions of dollars to keep a relatively small group of people in isolation, just for the sake of saying you're never setting foot on the Australian mainland. How do we address, or isn't the solution to the refugee crisis to address it at its root, to make sure that, and this comes into the whole policy of cruelty, or the whole notion of cruelty as policy, and that is to make sure that there is no impetus for people to have to flee their countries. How do we do that? Because you've thought about this for a long time.
Yeah, well, there has to be an internationalism. Yeah. In a way, one of the biggest obstacles is this phenomenon called sovereignty, the sovereign state. With our, Make America Great Again, vote for Brexit. These were massive statements about injustice, as far as I can see. I mean, a world that, on a planet that might end in 12 years, or people of the world faced by massive pandemics, the insistence on maintaining sovereignty by building 15 new funny submarines is absurd. We have to talk to. I mean, apart from anything else, my yardstick is to say to myself and to people I meet, "Would you like to make your life more interesting?" Well, that internationalism, the diversity of people and customs and so on, is what we need to embrace. Nobody on their deathbed usually says, "I wish I'd stayed alone and built a bigger wall around my house."
No, but I'm thinking though, Stuart, if you look at the tide of refugees fleeing Africa and it caused great controversy coming out of Syria in 2015, 2016. I would have thought the solution to that was not to have the kind of upheavals and economic want and exploitation and violence that occurred, for example, in Syria, and also the forms of economic exploitation, often caused, of course, by the global north, the wealthy global north, in places like Africa. I would have thought that's where you address the crisis.
Sure. Well, I mean, politically, a couple of quick responses to that. I mean, the United Nations has to be bolstered in every possible way, but so has the commitment of rich countries to overseas aid, because if we want to be serious about addressing those problems at source, they're frequently about poverty. They're about about men's idea, bolstered by derision of science and undue reverence for certain religions, that being macho, being sadistic, is a way to run things. And everywhere we go, we need to talk about the alternative. I mean, I've talked about those alternatives even to Chinese diplomats. It feels like water off a duck's back, but you have to persist.
I'm just thinking, it's not just foreign aid. There was an amazing figure produced by the International Tax Justice Network, which is an international church-based network, which said that Africa, for example, lost twice as much in lost taxation revenue from Western companies that simply didn't pay tax in those African countries than it received in foreign aid. Effectively, they were saying you could eliminate foreign aid and Africa would be twice better off if big corporations actually paid the taxes in those countries to those governments, so they could build up their health and education services, for example.
My father-in-law was a Norwegian politician.
Right.
And he used to say to me, high taxation equals civilization.
Yeah.
And that's the very opposite of what we expect in this country. And it's about, in any country, not just Africa, it's about how do you implement a policy. You can have something like taxation or universal health insurance, but you then have to learn how to implement it. And whether it's pink bats in the former Labour government or the war on poverty in America in the 60s, the issue was always, well, how do we implement the policy on a day-to-day basis?
You mention in this book the United Nations responsibility to protect idea. This again, because I do like it being complicated. This is complicated because on paper, responsibility to protect is a marvellous concept.
Sure.
But isn't responsibility to protect also then used to justify certain forms of modern imperialism? The Bush administration, after it decided after it conceded that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, then started to say, well, this was a terrible regime of Saddam Hussein's, and it was a very brutal regime, and this justified our invasion. It became a kind of quasi-responsibility to protect. I mean, despite the fact that the country's become an absolute morass, a nightmare since the United States-led invasion. responsibility to protect cuts both ways.
Sure. No, I agree. And the intervention in Libya produced a similar years of cruelty and chaos. And you can hear the dilemma over the responsibility to protect this morning over what's happening in Myanmar, because the young people in Myanmar are saying, what is this international community doing? They happen to say that if our allies were the Chinese or the Russians, they're saying they would have done something. So it's about intervention anywhere. Has all sorts of dilemmas. I mean, the responsibility to protect ideas started with a brilliant book in Britain called "Scream Quietly or the Neighbours Will Hear," and it was about telling men that their home was not a castle. They couldn't do what they liked. And that's, I mean, this is only, an intellectual pursuit on my part, but that's the problem with sovereignty. The assumption that once in power, people, leaders, almost always men, can do what they like.
Take Syria, for example, a terrible human rights tragedy. 50% of the population, I think, has been displaced from their homes. I think it's 20% that's actually been displaced out of the country itself. But Syria was a case, for example, where you certainly had an autocratic regime, because Assad has survived. And it wasn't just Assad's defenders who said this. Foreign policy realists, for example, said, well, what's the alternative to Assad? So was that, for example, a case where a regime that practiced a measure of cruelty in the sense that it was an autocratic regime was better than chaos and the cruelty and the bloodthirsty cruelty that came with ISIS?
Yeah, look,
see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I can see what you're getting at. I mean, look, it's assumed that there's an aspirin in international relations, that you just have to find the aspirin and apply it.
Yeah.
My experience is that to persuade, encourage bullies that there's a better way to live their lives, to persuade almost any man that there's a better way to use their power. There's a more creative, life-enhancing, non-destructive way. That should and could have gone on in a vigorous way, if you like, in diplomacy. The point at which Assad decided that he would fire on the young protesters, particularly a 14-year-old boy, who wrote "Your time next, Mr. President," following the hopes of the Arab Spring. Look, for me, it boils down to the language. If there'd been a much more vigorous language other than the use of bombs and guns, among leaders, among particularly bullies, there's this massive illiteracy about non-violence, and we have to be vigorous in expressing the alternative.
One of the things that particularly affected me about this book was the idea that cruelty can be very mundane. You have this reference to when you were a social worker, I think, in the UK. This was, what, the 70s, I think it was, Stewart? And
well, that's very kind of you. It was the 60s.
Okay. But there was a consultant's report done into the hospital to which you were attached, and it had something to do with counselling for the patients, or for the families of cancer patients. Tell me about that.
It was much closer to home. It was actually here. I think it was St Vincent's commissioned, as the University of Sydney had done before, gave $1 million or something like that to management consultants. When you don't have any ideas of your own, you employ a management consultant.
Or actually, you do have the idea, and you tell the management consultant what you want to do, but you ask them to say it for you.
And in their attempt, that they had one yardstick about assessing the performance in the hospital. It was this phenomenon called efficiency. and they identified the oncology wards as being highly inefficient. And there was a paragraph that said that social workers were even wasting time making tea for the patients, for the families of people who were suffering horrendous cancers. And I think it was on a Friday evening, the report to the superintendent of the hospital fell off the back of a truck into my office, and I read it over the weekend, and by Monday I'd written a retort and sent it to the medical superintendent, who replied that he was extremely grateful and he wouldn't take any notice of the management consultants. But that absurd preoccupation with this managerialist assumption called efficiency often gets in the way of humanity.
Yeah, that struck me as I say, particularly affecting, because they're essentially saying that cancer patients, they're going to die anyway. Why are we spending all of this money making their families feel good? I mean, that seemed to be the essence of what they were saying.
Absolutely.
But they didn't realise that it was a fundamentally cruel thing that they were saying.
No, because the theoretical baggage that they carry around in their heads is about being clean and tidy and orderly and predictable and efficient, and that's the story of their professional lives. That's how they were trained. That justifies the existence of their companies, and it's worldwide. I mean, any big city in the world, you can see the high-rise buildings advertising the existence of those companies. And for some reason or other, we're led to believe that if you were a bit more tidy and a bit more better on time, Andrew, the world would be different.
Yeah, it require a lot more punctuality on my part and tidiness on my part for the world to be better. Let's talk now about a post-COVID world, if we ever actually receive it, if it actually happens, because there's a lot of medical evidence to suggest we'll never be truly post-COVID. But COVID's done two things. It's shown us, in a sense, the best, but also the worst. What has shown us? What good things has COVID demonstrated? Well,
I think the realisation of community and solidarity, and the people didn't bother about demarcation disputes. They rolled their sleeves up, and even the Australian achievement of being respectful to one another by respecting social distance, by wearing masks, by, in essence, suppressing the dangers of the virus, which has not happened in most other parts of the world. That's very impressive. The other side of the coin is about the people who've lost out, and you can see in terms of employment figures, there's mostly been women, or disproportionately been women, and people who may find it very difficult to regain their jobs. So the idea that we might return to normal that's the most dangerous and unthinking remedy about the post-COVID society.
Yeah, the Pope has talked about this idea for COVID bringing a greater sense of interdependence, which is a big theme in your book, human interdependence. Sure. The Pope has talked about Western and wealthy countries not hoarding vaccines, for example. It seemed to me that COVID also showed us, though, a pretty self-centred element to humanity, because people in wealthier countries with lower density populations, Exhibit A, Australia, also New Zealand. I know everyone, talks in, celebratory terms about New Zealand at the moment, but a very easy country that's easy to quarantine, to stop people coming into. Not surprising that they did well, but you try being a COVID patient in the favelas of Brazil.
Sure.
Or in Gaza, for example.
Sure.
I mean, what did COVID show us about the inequalities?
Well, it highlighted them, and it highlighted the very opposite of the story and the set of principles that built a sense of justice in post-war Europe. Because I'm the beneficiary of policies that said every public policy should be about the dominance of altruism over egoism, of altruism over selfishness. That's the yardstick by which to measure policies, which is why we introduced universal health insurance. It was what an anthropologist called the gift relationship. I give you something without expectation of reward, which is the very opposite of what we're doing in the vaccination apartheid that's going on at the moment. But using, and I'll repeat that language because I think the repetition of values and of stories is crucial to imagining a future, and it has to be about the dominance of altruism over egoism, and in my view that makes life more interesting.
Until COVID, I always thought I was more of a communitarian, but I did discover, and I wonder whether this is the same with you, I did discover a little libertarian side to myself in this sense that when it came, for example, to lockdowns, it was very easy if people had country houses. It was very easy if they had large suburban plots with gardens. The people who used to write to me, if ever I put a dissenting voice on air, and it only happened twice, they all seemed to be people who were, very well superannuated in very nice gardens in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. But, for example, if you were someone sharing an apartment, 3 people, 4 people crammed into an apartment, the notion of quarantining, self-isolation is itself a pretty cruel kind, because these things were never equally applied. They could never be equally applied, could they?
Look, I mean, I've studied and been up to my neck in the implementation of public policies in lots of countries. And there's a principle called the exception to the rule, which is what we are not applying with regard to the treatment of asylum seekers. We've got this if you have one rule, you don't have to be very bright. You just keep on applying it. You can apply it, you can do that in Long Bay Jail or even in the military, but not in the governance, the humane governance of a country. So the exception to the rule in your excellent example is about the people marooned in small apartments in high-rise buildings in Sydney or Melbourne or elsewhere, and there could have been an exception to the rule. That's where the libertarian part of you emerges, I imagine.
Well, yeah, I mean, I also... People spoke, for example, about the countries that had dealt with this effectively. They'd either been very lucky countries like Australia and New Zealand that were effectively, that are islands, Taiwan another case, or they were places, for example, where you saw authorities welding up the doors to prevent people getting out. The response to COVID was one, as we say, effectively of inequality. Let's talk finally, and then we can, if people have some questions here in the audience, we should take those. But let's talk about the notion of poetry as an alternative to cruelty, because I think Shelley's your favourite poet, isn't he?
Yes, and a few others. I mean, I love Ujuru Nunakol. Look, I think we have to... I often say to students and colleagues, I want you to be promiscuous. And this isn't...
Ideologically.
This isn't a reference to the misuse of the prayer room in the federal parliament.
Right.
But by that I mean people should feel entitled to derive inspiration from any source. It might be great art, it might be your hospitality, in my case it's music and poetry. And I mean, Shelley was inspirational. I mean, he said that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And what he was really saying that you need to imagine what a post-COVID society could and should look like. That's what he was saying. Partly because in poetry you have to find a dimension that's elusive in prose. You know, the figures of speech in poetry, if you think of Yeats' poem "The Second Coming," which is, although it was written about the Irish War of Independence and the Troubles, if you read it again, it's appropriate today. Or the wonderful Aboriginal poet Oodgeroo Noonuccal, who said, I think, I'm for humanity, not colour jibes. I'm international, never mind tribes. I'm international, never mind place. I'm for humanity, all one race, which is about the interdependence you've just referred to.
That's controversial today, though. You know that, Stewart. Internationalism, universal values are controversial today, as controversial on the hard left as they are among nativists on the right.
Well, look, I want to engage in that discussion because wherever there's intolerance, wherever there's certainty, I'm anxious.
Yep.
I want people to trespass into uncertainty, which is really what great poetry or great music is about. I mean, I've given an example of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Peace Symphony, and all the people who voted for Brexit and the dreadful demagogues who advocated forgot that the Beethoven's Peace Symphony is the national anthem of the European Union.
Ode to Joy. Yeah.
Yes, and the libretto Ode to Joy. I mean, if you Schiller, the poet, said he wanted his poem to be a kiss for the whole earth. Well, that's what the Extinction Rebellion people are saying.
Yeah, there's a lot in the book which we're not going to have time to get to about Stewart's very broad idea of cruelty towards the earth, cruelty towards that which nurtures us, which is nature. Thank you, Stewart. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
And do we have... Yeah, Wes, for the... Yeah. Does anyone want to ask some questions? Shiket Mosselmain, who is a member of the New South Wales Parliament and our host. So the question from the Honourable Shiket Mosselmain was, how do we broaden the language of cruelty to get it into the popular vocabulary so it is better understood and into the law and into law and legislation, which is especially apposite in the case of Shiket because he's a lawmaker.
Sure. Well, I think there's a distinction between an argument that is rational, that where we make all sorts of careful references to justify what I'm saying about cruelty, or there's emotional communication. And I think that the latter is often overlooked. For example, if I want to explain why the possession and threat to use nuclear weapons is an appalling form of cruelty, it's very difficult to explain it to people with regard to, what I've just said. It seems to be on a plane that, can be easily dismissed. But if you listen to the survivors, this is the emotional slant, the emotional survivors of the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, then there's something incredibly compelling about that argument. And when it's the emotional narrative that has to be used, and it's often forgotten in, politicians forget it. The ones who are successful don't usually forget it. But leave the politics aside, because these discussions have to go on in every context, every day of the week, in the family, in the workplace, on the streets, in NGOs, and so on. I mean, human rights is not the peculiar possession of lawyers, for example.
Does anyone else want to ask it?
John.
Yep, John Cleary. Yep.
Sure. Look, I mean, I enjoy having conversations But there's often, in a certain technological age, the idea of having a conversation is unusual. A conversation about the distinction between the worthy and the unworthy, or the constant resurrection of the poor laws, because that's the spirituality issue that you're referring to. I mean, I used to work in the Central Criminal Court in London, the Old Bailey, and what I experienced was that until young men got into serious trouble, nobody had ever had a conversation with them in their lives. They'd been bussed around and ordered around, so that the spiritual element of trying to take people seriously and have a conversation was completely foreign to them. I mean, the great feature of Rumpole of the Bailey was that he was this humanitarian who knew how to have a conversation.
Gentleman here. Please stand up and project if you don't mind.
Do you want to repeat the question?
It is the question is a very, very good question. If I hear you correctly, sir, it is about the expenditure, the often wasteful expenditure, for example, on military infrastructure. You use the example of the billions of dollars spent by India and Pakistan defending themselves, I guess, from each other, and not investing in other more worthy human rights pursuits and infrastructure that would effectively eliminate the threat, because people wouldn't feel the threat. Is that? Oh, and also,
sure.
Yeah. Sure. And a very good point. Australia is supplying weapons, the same weaponry, to India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan. Australia's making a lot of money out of it by effectively feeding this feud between India and Pakistan.
Sure.
Is that? Yeah.
Yep. Look,
Thank you very much.
It's a good question. I mean, the problem of commitment to militarism, as though that is a way to the future, that has to be rejected, and the corporate support of militarism is a huge problem. I mean, Christopher Pyne, just before he left, when he was Minister of Defence, said he wanted Australia to move from 20th in the league table of supplying weapons to the world to become 10th, as though this was a splendid objective for Australia. And you know, we've been very slow to condemn what's going on in Myanmar, because there's a kind of reluctant militarism in Australia. We pretend to be about human rights, but we're all the time we think militarily. I mean, in the military parades, those appalling military parades that occurred in the capital of Myanmar yesterday, the Indians took part. The Indian government supported those parades. So partly because the we're good, Pakistan bad, that grossly oversimplified way of thinking and conducting policies is, I mean, I'm a great believer in using satire to debunk. I mean, why doesn't that go as a form of communication, as a form of government? And I've had responsibilities for big organisations in America as well as here. I mean, you have to laugh like a kookaburra at some of the absurd use of power, and that applies. And look what we could be here for the rest of the afternoon. Look what's going on in Kashmir. You know,
no one's got clean hands, though. We'll go to Ahmed in a moment, but no one's got clean hands here. For example, country that so many of us have admired for much of our lives, Sweden, terrific welfare state, much narrower gap between the rich and the poor, but it's one of the world's leading arms suppliers. It's the IKEA model. You know, you build we sell you the bits and pieces, you build the furniture. We sell you the weapon, you fight the war.
Sure. The same argument about, I mean, a socially just post-COVID society has to go on in Sweden. I mean, Sweden has been permanently neutral in order to be partisan.
Well, listen, thank you. Thank you very much for those of you who took the time to come today. Thank you for those of you who have been watching on YouTube and online and I'd now like to welcome Ahmed Pollitt from our host organisation, Affinity. Ahmed, thank you, and it's thank you again for hosting this event. Much appreciated.
Welcome, distinguished attendees and viewers, my newly extended families, uncles, aunties, cousins. Affinity's proud collaboration with the Sydney Peace Foundation and Brave Media stands as a proof of thought, support and advocacy of universal human values in positive peace. I'd like to sincerely thank the highly regarded peace ambassadors, wonderful world citizen and compassionate voice of humanity. My dear friend, Emeritus Professor Stuart Rees, I should call you Uncle Stewart. Thank you, Cousin Andrew, for fantastically facilitating the webinar, and my esteemed Uncle John Cleary for the warm welcoming. Additionally, I would like to sincerely thank my esteemed cousin Karen, who has made great contributions. My final thanks to the Honorable Shevkat Musulmani, MLC, for arranging the fantastic venue for this program. Thank you. Tonight's launch and conversation was truly inspiring and reflective of Professor Rees' new book, which is an essential and remarkable resource to understand how universal human rights and peace are significant for humanity to maintain a peaceful, healthy society. In his book, Professor Rees gives an inspirational roadmap to help humanity to live peacefully. This book is such an exception to portray the reality of the world we are living in. Human society has dreams, aspirations, and potentialities. I see the message of this book is a strong embrace of the spirit and substance of equality, unity of humanity, and peacefulness to live together. Professor Rees calls the language of common humanity. I like this call. In my humble view, the language of common humanity provides a foundation upon which to establish peace, human rights, freedoms, and the rule of law. Any interpretations to the contrary, including the abuse of the language of common humanity to fill conflicts, are simply wrong and deceitful. As we heard Professor Rees explain many different cruelties both today and his book, that these cruelties can come from states or individuals with the awful experience by victims. Wherever cruelty comes from, the consequences are very bad, and it is an unacceptable action towards human dignity. Every human was created as worthy, and every human life is sacred no matter their beliefs. Cruelty is not the way of humanity, and it contradicts the core values of human rights. Rather than cruelties, we should embrace all of humanity with compassion. The thoughts, values, and experience which are shared by the people of not only the same nation, but by all the nations of the world, to encourage tolerance and respect and promote unity, while at the same time preventing the divisions and dislikes from growing into open hostility and conflict. We are to maintain that regular and quality dialogue is essential in our time and promote mutual respect among all strata of the society. We nurture and encourage people to educate the heart and soul as well as the mind in order to revive and strengthen the universal human values and the rule of law in every corner of the world. In the words of Rumi, the lamps are different, but the light is the same. Though we speak in the different languages, we share the same message of unity. Peace, freedom of expression and religion, tolerance and equal opportunity are the values of Affinity, Sydney Peace Foundation, Brave Media and other institutions, UNAA New South Wales and others work to promote through service, education and dialogue through democracy and democratic values. Finally, I'd like to share with you Affinity's upcoming webinar that continues to raise and promote peace to our distinguished viewers. The International Day of Sport for Development and Peace on the 6th of April. This special event is in collaboration with UNAA New South Wales Division and will host 3 champion fighters for human rights. Enes Kanter, Portland Trail Blazers NBA player. Craig Foster AM, former Socceroo and human rights activist. And finally, Sonny Bill Williams, heavyweight boxer and former Olympian rugby league player. This program will be facilitated by Tracy Holmes, senior journalist, the Ticketek ABC. I look forward to hosting you next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Thank you for our lovely attendees and listeners. Thank you.